Hey US History, and welcome to your very last formal video lesson of the year. You made it. You did it. It's crazy. Next week we'll do a couple things, but it's not going to be like a new lesson like today. Today's the last one. So in deference to the second most votes, kind of the first most votes, today we're going to talk a little bit about civil rights, and we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, and then that's where we'll end. I'm so amazed at how far we were able to get this year. It's really cool. It's cool. And I'm so proud of you guys for what you've learned, for how far you've come, and for the community that you've developed as a class, that we've developed as a class, as much as I miss it now. Okay, so let's talk what happened right after Kennedy was assassinated. So November 22nd, 1963, an announcer interrupted all of the television broadcasts, all of them, with a shocking news bulletin. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by the shooting. Soon came the news. President Kennedy was dead. Only 2 days later, Kennedy's alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was gunned down by a Dallas nightclub owner in front of 70 policemen and a national television audience. Over the next 10 years, Americans endured a series of similar news bulletins. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was slain on the balcony of a motel in Memphis by a sniper. Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated in a California hotel during his presidential campaign. Democratic presidential hopeful Governor George Wallace of Alabama was shot and paralyzed in a mall parking lot in Maryland. These acts of violence were really only individual highlights of a decade of massive civil unrest. You've got urban riots, looting, killing, student protests, bloody clashes between protesters and the police, and above all, the carnage of the war in Vietnam that was not being won. The war in Southeast Asia might have been far away, but the fact that they now had television meant that it was brought into every living room. In the midst of this, they're looking to their political leaders, right? That's who Americans are looking for. So Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson, Republican Richard Nixon, but both men found that America's problems defied their best efforts. In the 60s, the U.S. was very much shattered by hatred and conflict. More than a few people wondered whether the social fabric could take the strain. But let's talk about what happened under Johnson. Johnson was well prepared. Lyndon B. Johnson was well prepared for political leadership. He was experienced, energetic, and crafty. He'd spent 12 years in the Senate, 5 years as the majority leader. Few other presidents have known how to work as well with Congress as Johnson did. He wanted to create a great society. Government would help citizens gain the opportunities to better themselves politically, socially, economically. Step 1, civil rights. Johnson won from Congress the legislation he needed to build his great society. Civil Rights Act of 1964. That was big. But then the following year, Johnson encouraged Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which sent federal officials into states to help blacks register to vote and outlawed literacy tests. Then the 24th Amendment, ratified in January of 1964, outlawed the uses of poll taxes. Both of these pieces of legislation were meant to help increase voting rights for all Americans, particularly those that were usually denied it. Then he wanted to launch a war on poverty. So the big deal with the war on poverty is he created this Office of Economic Opportunity, the OEO. The government attacked poverty through job training, job placement, Head Start, which was a preschool program for children in poor families, and volunteers in service throughout America, which is kind of like a domestic Peace Corps. You've got young people volunteering to work in government programs to help the poor. And then, of course, in the middle of this, you have an election, the 1964 election. He won by a landslide. Even before Kennedy's assassination, most politicians had predicted a Democratic victory, but the shock of the president's death made America even less likely to change leaders. He was further helped by the fact that his main opposition, Senator Barry Goldwater, was an honest, unbending conservative, and he refused to change his political message to please his audience, or to tailor his message to please his audience. He denounced Social Security system in front of senior citizens, and he talked about in Tennessee that the government shouldn't have the Tennessee Valley Authority. Needless to say, it's not exactly doing him any favors. Also, he spoke out against the Civil Rights Bill, which alienated any African American or black voters. And then liberal Republicans refused to support him in that too. Finally, he wanted to talk about using nukes in Vietnam. Needless to say, he didn't win. Johnson won. He garnered 486 electoral votes to 52. He only won 6 states, the other guy, Goldwater. And so he basically said, okay, cool. Johnson said, great, I won by this much. I can do a lot. And so it gave the Democrats huge majorities in Congress, too. They had a majority in the Senate. They had a 2/3 majority in the Senate and in the House. In the first session of Congress, Johnson used his tremendous victory to pass 89 bills, including one to aid education. The film that had the widest impact was probably Medicare, which was a government health insurance specifically meant for elderly. It was designed to ensure that the nation's elderly would be able to afford proper medical treatment. And they paid for this through a tax, a national tax. Even before the Johnson years, the Supreme Court was already doing a lot of these things, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. You have the Warren Court, which was around for about 16 years, all through the 60s. And they pursued this policy of judicial activism. They wanted to interpret the law and the Constitution broadly to address major social problems. So they're best known for a lot of civil rights decisions, one being Brown versus Board of Education, which we've learned about. And then, I think we learned about, the court also handed down decisions touching all areas. They placed greater restrictions on law enforcement officials and gave greater protection to accused criminals in Gideon versus Wainwright, which required states to provide an attorney for all defendants. And then in Miranda versus Arizona, it required that criminals be informed of their rights before they could be questioned. So if you ever heard you have the right to remain silent, that comes from that case Miranda versus Arizona. Those are called the Miranda rights. Then in Engel versus Vitale, the court banned state-sponsored prayers in public schools because that was a violation of the First Amendment. Then in Roth versus the United States, they ruled that obscenity was not protected by the First Amendment. But it defined obscenity so specifically that it actually made more obscenities legal and actually helped the pornography industry to grow because it defined obscenity excluding that. In another decision, they ordered the redrawing of legislative districts. So they said that districts were unequal in population, so they wanted equal protection of the law. Not all of the justices agreed with this, though. But a majority of the associates of the people that didn't agree didn't necessarily follow it. So there was a lot of big stuff happening. Then the Great Society, Johnson's Great Society, did it work? Ultimately, no. Individual programs alleviated some of the effects on poverty and inequality. But Johnson's utopian goal, he wanted a utopia, and it of course doesn't happen. Poverty, inequality, and unrest remain. The nation seems to be more divided at the end of Johnson's presidency than it was at the beginning, despite the fact that he didn't do a bad job. Conservative critics said that government legislation and regulation weren't enough. Basically, they're saying, like, don't bother trying to use government regulation to help because it won't. And that's a debate that's actually raging today right now, is how much the government should help. Ultimately, a lot of people said the individual was responsible for helping himself, especially conservatives, which is something that remains true right now. But the most famous of all the conflicts, of the international conflicts in the 1960s, was the Vietnam War, which is another overflow of the Cold War. The Vietnam War had nothing to do with America. It in no way was going to touch American soil. So why did we fight in it? Because we were committed to maintaining a non-communist government in South Vietnam. This had begun under Eisenhower. He had sent 2,000 military advisors. Kennedy sent 16,000 military advisors to Vietnam. The troops were meant to be there to train and advise the South Vietnamese army and to protect other American personnel that were there. They were not there to fight. But one historian said that it was like a tar. The more the United States wanted to free themselves, the more stuck they became. Under Johnson, the advisors became fighters, and the United States became engaged in a full-fledged war, kind of slipped into it. During Johnson's campaign for the presidential election of 1964, Johnson said, "We are not going to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. But there was an incident that occurred off the coast of Vietnam in 1964 that changed this. In the summer of 1964, the American destroyer, the Maddox, repulsed an attack by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The affair was relatively minor, but it involved North Vietnamese patrol boats versus an American ship. So Johnson denounced the attack and said, "Congress, I would like to respond by increasing my aggression." He said that they attacked an American ship, and so we want to fight back. Congress overwhelmingly approves this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, approving the determination of the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States. Armed with the resolution, Johnson now begins to escalate the war in Vietnam, which involves increasing the number and expanding the role of American troops, so sending more people and having them do more. Americans began to take over a large part of the fighting from the South Vietnamese army. So actually you have the Americans doing more of the fighting than the South Vietnamese army is doing. Who are they fighting? They're fighting the North Vietnamese communists. Who were the North Vietnamese communists aided by? The Soviet Union. What is the Vietnam War? It is an overflow of the Cold War, hands down. By 1968, U.S. forces in Vietnam numbered more than 500,000. Johnson also ordered American bombers to extend the war to North Vietnam. He had them actually, instead of just fighting to defend South Vietnam, he actually now has the bombers start attacking and bombing North Vietnam. But the thing is, Americans, especially the politicians and military generals, were like, okay, it's a conflict in Southeastern Asia. It's not going to be that hard to win. Like, it shouldn't be. But there were 5 things that made the war way more difficult than they thought. First of all, Americans are kind of fighting 2 different fronts, but they're not fighting 2 different sides. So it's not like the Korean War where you had North Korea versus South Korea. Here you have the communist Vietnamese, which are mostly North Vietnam, but North Vietnam isn't a separate country, and you also have Southern Vietnamese communists who agree with them that are also fighting. So it's not really like one side versus the other. The North Vietnamese and the pro-communist South Vietnamese guerrillas were called the Viet Cong. So these are pro-communist South Vietnamese guerrillas. But when I say guerrillas, I mean people that would hide, people that would fight from the treetops, people that would ambush. And this is actually one of the most famous groups of people in the Vietnam War because they were so ruthless. And so where is this even being fought? It's mostly being fought in South Vietnam. The cities are held by the government of South Vietnam, but the countryside is very much controlled by the Viet Cong. At the same time, both China and the Soviet Union are supplying North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. So second, supplies. So one was, we don't really know who we're fighting. It's not very clear cut. 2, supplies. Supplies for the communist forces from North Vietnam are flowing across the north-south border, but they're also flowing through the neighboring and neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia. And those are to the west. Such supply lines are impossible to cut without attacking those nations. And given that they were neutral, kind of like America was neutral in World War I and World War II for a while, America didn't want to attack those nations because that would very much start war, but with those nations. And so they didn't want to, but those nations are sending supplies to the North Vietnamese and to the Viet Cong. 3, the government of South Vietnam. It wasn't communist, but it was corrupt, it was undemocratic, and it was very unstable. The only advantage it offered to Americans was they said, well, it's better than the communists, but really not by much. 4th, civilian leadership in both the executive and legislative branches of the United States wants to micromanage this war, rather than to set broad strategy and let the military professionals figure it out. The civilian leaders tended to let politics play into their decisions instead of what was actually best. And 5, and most importantly, Johnson was committed to the idea of this limited defensive war. He didn't want to risk outright war against North Vietnam, because that might, if they officially declared war, then the Soviet Union or China might declare war back, and that would be bad. Then we would have World War III. It would divert dollars from the Great Society. It would be politically damaging, and of course it could start nuclear warfare, which we don't want to do. So he wants to conduct a war but not allow it to affect the economic prosperity of his people, so he doesn't ever fully commit to the war. For the soldiers, though, the war is this unreal nightmarish experience. The Viet Cong looked, dressed, and acted exactly like South Vietnamese civilians until they opened fire. So you couldn't fire at them because you couldn't tell if it was innocent civilians or Viet Cong. And this was women, children, men, everybody. There were no clear fronts. There were no lines of battle. Enemy forces would suddenly emerge from the jungle and then disappear into the jungle. The thick forests or the networks of tunnels. The Viet Cong had tunnel networks. If you remember from the Military History Museum that we went to, we actually saw there was a display of the tunnel network of the Viet Cong. They tried to cope using technology. So there were helicopters armed with machine guns carrying troops. Napalm, Agent Orange, other chemical defoliants. They burned through the jungle cover. American fighter planes and bombers pounded enemy positions, but the enemy keeps coming back. American military at times seemed to be trying to win the war just by sheer firepower. In an extreme case, one major said it was necessary to destroy the town to save it. And so the Vietnam War is a complete mess, and it's awful for anybody involved. Absolutely awful. Grumblings about the war are starting to arise among American people, too. You have this student protest movement that's growing. The large majority of Americans, though, still supported the war, at least at the beginning. Unfortunately, that support was partially the result of misrepresentation and outright deception by the government. President Johnson feared that if Americans knew how deeply committed the United States had been in the war, and how the war was actually going, they would stop supporting him and therefore stop supporting his Great Society programs that had to do with civil rights, the war on poverty, social rights, things like that. Therefore, he disguised the number of U.S. troops involved in the conflict and covered up all of the setbacks. But the media was beginning to tell a different story because now the media is starting to get involved. And this is really the first time in American history that the media and the government almost go to war against each other. Support for the war begins to change dramatically after the communists launched something called the Tet Offensive in January of 1968. During the South Vietnamese celebration of Tet, which was the Lunar New Year, January 30th, the Viet Cong infiltrated major cities in the South. They smuggled in arms, carrying them into cities in coffins during funeral processions or things like that. On the first day of the New Year, 60,000 Viet Cong troops launched attacks on nearly every major city and strategic point in South Vietnam. One force even captured part of the U.S. Embassy. In the weeks that followed, Americans and South Vietnamese forces slowly drove back the enemy and recaptured what had been lost and inflicted massive casualties. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a failure for the communists. They launched this massive attack and were driven back and incurred major losses. But it had a dramatic effect on the American public perception. Television newscasts emphasized only the negative. Sound familiar? Leading many Americans to believe that the Tet was actually a communist victory. The U.S. government, to some extent, reaped what it had sown. Having misled the American people and the media, the government now faced the wrath of a public who wanted to know how things could have come so close to disaster so suddenly. They didn't even think there were that many people over there. They didn't think it was that serious. After Tet, many Americans didn't care about winning the war anymore. They just wanted to get out. This isn't our war. In May of 1968, the North Vietnamese offered to hold peace negotiations, and the U.S. said, sure. The Paris peace talks began with heated discussion over a very critical topic. And that critical topic was, what shape of table do we use? After that very unpromising start, the peace talks dragged on for 5 years while fighting continues in Vietnam. The United States wanted out, but they also wanted to preserve South Vietnam as a non-communist nation, so they wouldn't just give it up. North Vietnam wanted the reunion of the two nations under communist rule. So the talks drag on year after year after year after year while the fighting continues. So, and while this is happening, of course, you have incredible civil disturbances happening in the United States. Opponents of the civil rights movements, radical youth, anti-war movements, things like that. So it's really a mess. And as much as I dislike leaving you with the last lesson of U.S. history, with America being in almost shambles, I mean, it happened, and it's important to know about it. So, as much as I wish we could talk more, I'm hopeful that this starts you understanding how to research things that were happening and understanding where kind of the rift between the media and the government maybe started. So with that said, I hope that you've enjoyed all of the videos. I hope that you've enjoyed learning as much as you could over this quarantined time. And thanks for watching the very last video. If you, let me think of a good one. If you send me, trying to think. Tell me about something that happened during the Vietnam War, in the Vietnam War, or tell me something a little bit extra about one of the Warren Court cases. So if you email me a fun fact, although it's probably not fun, a fun fact about the Warren Court or the Vietnam War, then I will give you some extra credit for making it through our very last video lesson. But with that said, you guys, I hope you have an awesome rest of your day. I hope you have an awesome weekend. Email me if you have problems. Remember, Wednesday, May 20th is the absolute last day that I will accept any work. Okay? And tomorrow, May 15th is the last day that I will let you make up a test or retake a test, okay? So with that said, have an awesome rest of your day. Thinking about you guys, praying for you guys, and congratulations, you're almost seniors. Okay, bye guys.